So one of the questions I get asked all the time as a queer Christian theologian and pastor is, how do you reconcile your queer identity with the Bible and with the Christian faith? Because most people tend to know that Christianity is against LGBT people. In fact, in about 2011, I think, the Barna Institute did a poll and asked Americans, what was the first thing they thought of when they heard the word Christian? And the top result was anti-homosexual. You see, in America, Christianity has become known for its opposition to LGBT people, to the queer lifestyle, to queer rights. And so, seeing someone like me, an openly gay Christian pastor and theologian and author, people, both in the queer community and in the Christian community, ask, how do you do this? Why do you do this? Because people assume that Christianity is in fact anti-gay, that the Bible is in fact anti-queer people. I once believed that. Of course, I grew up in a church that did in fact teach it was a sin to be gay. My pastor railed against the gay rights movement and the assault on family values. I grew up believing that this part of me that I didn't know exactly how to articulate at the time was sinful and broken, and that if I ever allowed it to bubble to the surface, if I ever acknowledged that this part of me existed, it would render me under God's judgment and outside of the Christian fold. I believed that all the way up till the time I went away to Bible college. Bible college is where young Christians go, young evangelicals go to study to become a pastor in undergrad. And I went off to a college in Chicago to study the Bible and to get on track to become an evangelical pastor. And I believed that by doing this, by going off to college, by giving my life to serve God, that God would take away this struggle and I would never have to deal with it again. It was a common phrase in our Bible college that you would come in and get a ring by spring. Every young aspiring pastor believed that you would go to this Bible college not just to get a biblical education, but to get a wife. And so I also believe that. I believe once I started the program, once I started studying the Bible, once I lived in this monastic type setting with other young aspiring pastors and missionaries, that I would get a wife and my homosexuality would go away. But actually, the opposite happened. When I went to Bible college, I was shocked within the first week to meet other people, other young aspiring pastors and theologians and missionaries who told me they struggled with same-sex attraction. And that opened Pandora's box for me, because many LGBT Christians feel like we're the only ones. When you grow up in an environment that tells you it's a sin to feel these things, to be attracted the way you're attracted, to have these questions about your gender identity, you become isolated. And you can't speak about these things, and no one else speaks about these things, and so you begin to think that you're the only one. But as soon as I realized that there were other folks struggling with the same thing that I struggled with, it gave me a sort of permission to begin studying, exploring, asking questions. Because clearly this was bigger than just a sin struggle that I had. This was something that many people were wrestling with. And when I actually started looking at what the Bible said about homosexuality and what the Christian tradition had said about sexuality in general, I quickly began to realize that things were not as clear as I was told they were. You might know that in the Bible there are 6 passages that bring up the topic of homosexuality. There are 2 passages in the book of Leviticus, 1 passage in the book of Genesis, there's a passage in the book of Romans, a passage in the book of 1 Corinthians, and a passage in 1 Timothy. 3 Hebrew Bible passages and 3 New Testament passages. And first and foremost, acknowledging that there are only 6 verses that address homosexuality in the hundreds of thousands of verses that make up the Bible, says how little this topic actually impacts the broad narrative of Christian faith, and it shows just how disproportionate Christians have been in putting this emphasis on homosexuality, something that the Bible almost never mentions. And once I started looking at the history the culture, the literary context of these passages, once I started studying Greek and Hebrew, I began to see that these passages, these 6 verses, when understood in proper context, were a lot more complex than I had heard from the pulpit of my church. Take, for instance, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in the book of Genesis. The word sodomite comes from this story as a pejorative against gay sex. Gay people were called sodomites for a couple centuries, based on the belief that Sodom and Gomorrah, these 2 cities found in the book of Genesis, were destroyed because of homosexuality. Well, when I opened the Bible and I read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, it became clear that whatever was happening in this text, it wasn't homosexuality. It wasn't a group of people who were attracted to the same sex seeking to engage in sexual relations. If you actually recall the story, 2 angelic visitors come into the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah to visit a righteous man named Lot. And when these 2 angels arrive at Lot's doors, the people of the city, the men of the city, recognize these foreigners have just entered into their town. And so they rush over to Lot's door, begin banging on the door and saying, Lot, bring out these visitors, these foreigners, these folks that are not from our town, that are not like us. Bring them out of your house because we are going to rape them. Now, reading this without any understanding of culture or context, it seems really strange. Why are these men seeking to randomly rape these foreigners, these angels? Well, in many ancient cultures, there was a great deal of what we would call xenophobia today. Other cultures, other people, other tribes were seen as inherent threats. And so if a group of people from an alternative tribe or culture entered into your city, your initial thought wouldn't be, oh, let's welcome in the stranger. Your thought generally might be, this is a threat. These are a threat, and we need to deal with them. And one prominent way in an ancient patriarchal culture that people who weren't supposed to be in a particular area were dealt with is through sexual domination. Because in the ancient patriarchal worldview, if you could sexually penetrate another man of equal status from another culture or another town or another tribe, you were emasculating them. You were asserting your dominance and the dominance of your manhood and your culture. And so this mob that arrives at Lot's door, they're seeking to assert dominance over these foreigners, these visitors to Lot's house, to assert the fact that their culture, their people are superior to the people that have arrived at Lot's house. Again, we're told as insiders in the story that these are actually angels. These aren't people from another town. These are angelic beings come down from heaven. And so when this mob of men arrives at Lot's house, bang on the door and say, let us destroy, dominate these foreigners, Lot says no. Because Lot, on the other hand, is going against the cultural grain and following what the Hebrew Bible calls faithful followers of Yahweh to do, which is to welcome the stranger, to care for the outsider. Lot wants to protect these 2 foreigners, these 2 visitors. Lot wants to show hospitality to them. And so Lot protects them from this mob. Now, strangely and terrifyingly in the story, Lot offers up his daughters. He tells the mob, take my daughters instead, thinking that being able to gang rape his daughters would somehow appease the crowd's anger and would protect the visitors. This is a horrifying story, and there's really no moral case to be made for Lot's behavior here. But what we find is after this happens, God then rains down fire on Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot and his family get out of the town, and all of the townspeople are destroyed. And we're told in the text of Genesis that the reason the towns are destroyed is because of immorality. Now, from that text, from that story, I've articulated it in as much detail as the Bible provides. That's where people take the idea that the townspeople were gay, they were seeking to gang rape these 2 men, and the reason God destroys the city is clearly because of their homosexuality. Now, that's not an original interpretation of the text. That's not how the early Jewish readers of that text interpreted it. That's actually a later Christian understanding of the text. And it's actually quite surprising that in the book of Ezekiel, The Hebrew Bible goes out of its way to tell us the reason Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed is not because of homosexuality. Of course, the concept of homosexuality didn't even exist in the ancient world. But Ezekiel tells us the reason Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed was because their lack of hospitality. That was the transgression. Because again, the Hebrew Bible calls faithful followers of Yahweh to welcome the stranger, the outsider, to care for the visitor. And we're even told, taking from this story in Hebrews in the New Testament, that when you care for the stranger, you are sometimes entertaining angels unaware, the text says. That's taking that from the Sodom and Gomorrah story, saying we should always be caring for strangers and outsiders that show up to our door, because these might be angelic visitors. The idea is you never know when God might show up, and so you should love and care for everyone. Jesus uses the same principle when he says, whatsoever you do to the least of these, you do to me, saying, I am in the midst of the stranger, the orphan, the outsider, so care for them. See, Sodom and Gomorrah is a powerful tale, albeit morally questionable, about why we should care for the least of these and how strongly God takes God's desire for God's people to care for the least of these. God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah because of their ravenous desire to assert dominance and to hurt a foreigner, a stranger, and an outsider. The text, best understood and best interpreted by the Bible, is against xenophobia. It's against racism and cultural superiority, something that Christians have trafficked in for about 2,000 years. It would be a much more profound text if we actually interpreted it the way that the Bible clearly talks about it, rather than making it about homosexuality. And even if you get down to the most fundamental details of the story, it's not actually about homosexuality, because these were angels, not human beings. And thus, the men were seeking to gang rape heavenly beings. We even see that interpretation spoken of in the book of Jude, when Jude tells us that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because of the men's desire for strange flesh. The strange flesh is the flesh of angels. So, you see, just one story out of the 6 verses that people say condemn homosexuality, when you actually look into the details of the culture and the context, it's clear that it's not about homosexuality. And in fact, to make the leap to make it about homosexuality requires you to contort the text, to read things into it that are not there. That's, again, just the first text in the Bible that seemingly talks about homosexuality. The other 2 texts in the Hebrew Bible, Leviticus 18:22, is the primary one, which says, a man shall not lie with a man as with a woman, for this is an abomination. On the surface, when you read that text out of context with a modern lens, it sure sounds like it's just a plain condemnation of gay sex. Now, what I discovered as I've studied these texts, not just while I was in college, but over the past decade, is that I don't think that the Bible is necessarily pro-LGBT, and I don't think we need to contort the Bible to be pro-LGBT. But what I do believe, and what I have come to understand, is that the Bible is not as overtly anti-LGBT, and the verses and places people find anti-LGBT sentiment from the Bible are not actually as powerful of weapons as they think they are. Leviticus 18 is a chapter in the Levitical law given to the nation of Israel, to the Jewish people only. That's what the book of Leviticus is. It's a section of 612 laws given to the nation of Israel exclusively, to the Jewish people exclusively, about ritual behaviors that they are supposed to practice within their religion, within their land. Leviticus 18, verse 1 and verse 2 essentially say, and this is my summary, do not be like the Egyptians, where I am bringing you from, or the Canaanites, to which I am bringing you to. Remain pure, because I am the Lord your God. Leviticus 18, that chapter, is a series of divine dictates for the people of Israel to keep them pure and unlike Israel or Canaan, or unlike Egypt and Canaan. They were just coming out of captivity in Egypt, and they are just about to conquer the land of Canaan. And so God is saying there's going to be cultures and the influence of these cultures and these religions that you're going to come in contact with. You should not bring those cultural influences with you. You should maintain a strict cultural and religious distinction from these other cultures. And if you go through the list of Leviticus 18, there are a number of strange commands that are clearly not moral commands, but are very specific ritual commands. For instance, Leviticus 18, verse 20, the verse right before the one that says, "A man shall not lie with a man as with a woman," says, "Do not sacrifice your child to Molech, for this is an abomination." You see, this list of commands are about practices that were taking place in the pagan cultures that surrounded the people of Israel. And God is saying, don't do those things. Don't bring those religious ideas with you. Don't bring those cultural practices with you. Remain distinct and pure and devoted to me. The context of Leviticus, again, isn't universal moral law about what is right or wrong. It's cultural principles about how to resist cultural influence and maintain your distinction and devotion to the one true God. That's the context when we read the words, "A man shall not lie with a man as with a woman, for this is an abomination." Now, scholars of both ancient Egypt and ancient Canaan can't find a ton of homosexuality in those cultures. There is some homosexuality in ancient Egypt in particular, but it was by no means very popular or prevalent, and it wasn't widely accepted. There are some instances where it seems to have been acceptable among some pharaohs, for instance, but in general, Egypt didn't have a ton of homosexuality. So why would this text be saying, stay away from men having sex with men as with women, which was not a dominant practice in Egypt or Canaan? Well, you have to ask, if it wasn't a common practice, where was it generally practiced in those cultures? And a lot of scholars have suggested that Leviticus 18 is specifically talking about sexuality related to temple prostitution. This is also a controversial area, but in many of these ancient cultures, there were pagan religious ceremonies in which people would have sex to appease gods and goddesses. And so one potential interpretation of Leviticus 18, in line with the context of everything else in that chapter, is that the sex being talked about in verse 22 is in relation to idolatry. Again, the verse right before it says, "Don't sacrifice your child to Molech," which is talking about pagan worship. So it's conceivable that the context of 18:22 is, "Don't have sex with men as with women, for this is an abomination," in the context of worshiping false gods or goddesses. Now, the other generally accepted interpretation is that what's being condemned is a violation of the patriarchal ordering of the world. Now, what do I mean? In the ancient Hebrew culture, it was assumed that men were superior to women, and that's how God intended the world to be. And so one of the reasons homosexuality in particular would be condemned is because a man would participate in making another man like a woman, in emasculating another man by penetrating or having sex with him, making that man take the role that is traditionally feminine. And in many ancient cultures, sex is not just seen as a romantic or erotic experience, but a social and political experience. And so if people began engaging in same-gendered sex, that is a threat to the broader social ordering. And it was seen as an act of literal emasculation, taking away the coveted masculinity of another man. And so the broader reason that we can certainly say is true in Leviticus is what's being condemned is men engaging in anal sex, which turned a man into, quote unquote, a woman or into a feminine gender role. And that was seen as a transgression of the created order and thus condemned. Now the question is, do we still believe in that version of patriarchy? Almost no Christians in the modern world hold to an idea that men are superior to women and that one's social status comes from one's role in a sexual relationship. It's a very archaic, ancient, patriarchal way of understanding the world. And so what Leviticus could be condemning is the emasculating of another man, but we don't believe that sex emasculates or enacts one's gender. Your role in a sexual relationship has no bearing on your standing in society or your standing as far as gender goes. And so that paradigm doesn't even apply to our modern world. The other thing that needs to be realized the final straw for Leviticus not being applicable to our modern conversation is, again, that the book of Leviticus is addressed only to the Jewish people and only to the nation of Israel. These are ritual practices meant to be taking place within the land of Israel by the Jewish people only. These are not moral commands. These are ritual commands. In fact, the word abomination does not mean moral wrong. It means ritual or religious wrong. So whatever's being condemned in Leviticus, both in 18 and in chapter 20, are not moral wrongs. They are ritual wrongs. They are for the people of Israel only, and therefore not applicable to the broader world outside of the nation of Israel and outside of the Jewish religion. So this would not be a place Christians should find any justification for an anti-LGBT perspective. That brings us to the New Testament. The most prominent scripture in the New Testament that's often quoted against LGBT people is from the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans. In Romans chapter 1, Paul lists essentially his version of a story of how the ancient Roman culture fell away from God's ideal into disarray. And Paul says, the ancient Romans exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped created things instead of the creator God. Paul says, because the ancient Romans rejected God's revelation, God showing God's self through nature, and began worshiping their own pagan idols, God gave them over to a debased mind, to a sinful, darkened mind, where they could no longer see the truth. Idolatry is where that descent into darkness begins in Paul's understanding of ancient Rome. And then Paul says, a few verses later, men exchanged natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Likewise, women also exchanged natural relations with men and were inflamed with lust for one another. And God gave them over to their lusts, and they received in themselves the due penalty of their error. Now, again, if you just read those verses out of context, men exchanged natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Likewise, women, that sounds just like a condemnation of gay sex, right? But the question you have to ask is, where is it happening in the text? What's the rest of the text saying? What is Paul trying to argue? Again, he's arguing the fall of Roman culture away from God. Paul presupposes, he says, therefore God gave them over to the lusts of their heart because they first engaged in idolatry. Paul's linking the homosexual sexual relations to pagan idolatry. The pagan idolatry is the reason the gay sex is happening in this context. So you have to ask the question, where in the ancient Greco-Roman world did gay sex happen? And is there any instance where gay sex happened in relation to idolatry? And the answer is yes. All over the great ancient Greco-Roman world, and particularly in ancient Rome, there were cults that engaged in temple prostitution, like we talked about in the book of Leviticus. You can Google Magna Mater cult, or you can Google Bacchus, the god Bacchus, or you can Google the goddess Aphrodite. All three of these were prominent cults in the ancient Greco-Roman world, and all three of these cults engaged in ritual sex and temple prostitution, sex to appease the god and goddess. Bacchanalias are something that many people have heard of. That's a reference to an ancient festival that would happen about once a year in ancient Rome, where essentially people would honor the god Bacchus by coming out of their houses and drinking alcohol until they got drunk and engaging in orgies. Paul is looking at that culture and that behavior and saying, look, clearly you've fallen away from God, and part of that falling away from God is engaging in this ritualized, orgiized gay sex. So it's not just a condemnation of gay sex in general, it's a condemnation of a very specific kind of gay sex happening in a very specific culture in a very specific context. Now, what we also have to remember is that Paul is Jewish. Paul comes from a Jewish background. And so Paul's bringing with him the whole Levitical paradigm and reading that into the world that he's speaking into. Paul later on in his writings will wrestle with whether the Jewish law applies to Gentiles, and Paul actually comes to conclude that it doesn't, that Gentiles do not need to try to uphold the Levitical law, that Christ did away with the need to adhere to the Levitical law. But in this passage, we might be able to interpret Paul as bringing with him his understanding of Leviticus and the ritual code of Leviticus that he was bound to as a Jewish person living in Israel. And he's reading that into the Roman situation. He's reading that he believes patriarchy is God's ordering of the world, and for a man to engage in sex with another man is a subversion of the patriarchy. And likewise, a woman to engage in sex with a woman is a subversion of the patriarchy. And so two things are going on here. Clearly, one, it seems that Paul is understanding a version of gay sex that's tied to temple prostitution. Again, not a general condemnation of homosexuality, but a very specific condemnation of a specific kind of gay sex. And he seems to be reading in a Levitical context, and that doesn't apply to the Greco-Roman world. It doesn't apply to non-Jewish people outside of the nation of Israel. And Paul himself will later conclude that in later writings. So Romans 1 is not a strong, clear condemnation universally of homosexuality. It's a condemnation of a very specific practice or a reenactment, a reading into the Roman culture of Paul's understanding of patriarchy, which Christians no longer adhere to. So that text falls apart as a condemnation for homosexuality. Now, Paul has two other writings in the New Testament, one in 1 Corinthians and one in 1 Timothy, where he uses a word, arsenokoitai. There were about 15, give or take, words in ancient Greek that referred to gay sex, the various kinds of gay sex. When Paul decides to condemn gay sex in 1 Corinthians and in 1 Timothy, he doesn't use any of those words that were common in the language, that anybody who would have heard or read the text would have known. Instead, he makes up a word that never appears in Greek until Paul uses it, and is scarcely used after Paul uses it. And that word is arsenokoitai. Now, what does this word mean? Where does it come from? Paul makes this word up by reading the Greek Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And in Leviticus 18:22 in Greek, it says, "An arson, a man, shall not coiton, bed, with an arson, a man, for this is an abomination." Let me say that again. In the Greek translation of Leviticus 18:22, the text reads, "An arson shall not coiton with an arson, for this is an abomination." And so Paul, looking at that Greek text, creates a word, arsenokoitai. Arson means man, koitai means bed, man better, which is referring specifically back to Leviticus 18:22. So in 1 Corinthians and in 1 Timothy, Paul is condemning whatever was being condemned in Leviticus. And as we already explored, Leviticus, that passage, 1, is a reference only to Hebrew people. 2, is functioning within a paradigm of a very particular cultural understanding of patriarchy that most Christians don't adhere to anymore. And 3, could also be referring to a very specific kind of cultural practice that was taking place in ancient pagan cultures that is not loving consensual same-sex sex, but pagan, exploitative, false god worshipping sexual behavior. Paul, whatever he's referring to in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, is the same thing he believes the Levitical writer was referring to. And again, it doesn't seem that the Levitical writer was just condemning homosexuality, meaning the affection of two men for one another, or gay sex, but a very specific kind of gay sex in a very specific culture in a very specific context. So this is a broad, quick overview in 30 minutes, but I give you all of that to say, when you look at these texts in their culture and context, when you actually dig beneath just our modern interpretations and reading one single verse, you begin to see that these are complex texts, that they're not at all as clear as Christians have made them out to be. And that in fact, if you're a true biblical scholar who is taking the full evidence and the context of these texts seriously, you have to conclude that these texts don't likely condemn modern loving same-sex relationship, but a very particular kind of sexual behavior taking place in very particular cultures in the ancient world. And many of the assumptions that undergird these condemnations are not assumptions that modern Christians or modern people in general believe in. Thus, these condemnations don't bear any weight in our modern world. And to try to enact them in our modern world is to try to resurrect a kind of cultural patriarchy and a kind of ancient culture that doesn't exist. So all of that is to say As somebody who takes seriously my faith in the Bible and who has studied these texts, I've come to the conclusion that the Bible does not clearly condemn homosexuality, that my faith doesn't give a clear reason to condemn same-sex love and same-sex intimacy, and thus there's no problem, there's nothing stopping me or any other LGBT person from taking our place at the table of God's grace. Now, again, this is just a very surface level explanation, and there is so much more that I could go into on each one of those passages and on a broader understanding of sexuality in the Bible, but I just wanted to give you this to get a brief understanding of why we should not just take what people say about the Bible and homosexuality for granted, and why in-depth study is really important. Because if you don't study the Bible and you just take these faulty interpretations for granted, you will enact great harm. Millions of LGBT people over thousands of years have been excluded and harmed by these bad interpretations. And by actually digging deep into the Bible and studying it in depth, we can actually open up space for healing and to welcome in more beloved queer people into the movement that Jesus began. So that's a little overview of my journey to reconcile faith and sexuality. I hope it's helpful to you. I hope it begins a journey for you to start thinking through these things critically. And I look forward to continually engaging in these conversations as, again, we stake out space for LGBT people in the table of God's grace.